This chart compares two paths of political sovereignty. On the left, historical European state formation runs parallel with massive spikes in industrial manufacturing. On the right, look at Uganda following its 1962 independence. Manufacturing output remains entirely flat, while imported goods surge. The gap between these lines reveals a historical paradox. Political power transferred to indigenous leaders, but failed to trigger a domestic industrial revolution. It is easy to look at that flat line and blame a lack of local entrepreneurial spirit, or simply point to individual government corruption. But those are symptoms, not the disease. The failure of post-colonial development is an embedded structural feature of the economic class that inherited control of the state apparatus when the colonizers left. To understand why the factories were never built, we must examine the specific economic history of the class that assumed control of the post-colonial state. In his 1961 text, The Wretched of the Earth, psychiatrist and political theorist Franz Fanon provided the primary diagnostic framework for analyzing this exact problem. Fanon started by defining the historical European bourgeoisie. That class accumulated capital by destroying feudalism, heavily investing in research, and building the physical factories that revolutionized the means of production. He then defined what he called the national bourgeoisie, the indigenous capitalist class that assumed power in African nations following decolonization. The national bourgeoisie did not emerge by overthrowing an old economic order to build a new industrial one. They inherited a colonial administrative structure designed exclusively to extract raw materials and import finished European goods. They were handed capital, but zero industrial base. Because they inherited an extractive system, the national bourgeoisie possesses nominal political sovereignty, but structurally lacks the productive capacity required to generate sovereign wealth. Fanon argued that this national bourgeoisie is structurally incapable of domestic industrialization. Imagine a post-colonial African merchant with significant capital. They face a choice: spend that capital building a domestic textile factory, or use it to secure the rights to import finished shirts from abroad. Building the factory requires inherited technical knowledge, domestic research infrastructure, and the scale to compete with established global manufacturers on cost. The merchant class has none of these things. The rational, risk-averse financial decision is to avoid manufacturing entirely. Instead, they use their capital and political connections to secure state-sanctioned monopoly rights over imports and distribution. This diagram illustrates the resulting economic loop. The national bourgeoisie inserts itself purely as an intermediary. They extract wealth by taking a cut as foreign goods move across the border, rather than inventing or building anything domestic. Notice the labels: raw materials out, finished goods in. This dynamic perfectly reproduces the exact economic structure of colonialism. It merely replaces foreign administrators with local actors managing the transaction. Without the ability to generate wealth through physical production, the national bourgeoisie remains permanently locked in an extractive intermediary role. That intermediary choice triggers Fanon's second core argument: structural dependency. An economy built entirely on retail commerce, services, and raw material exports is highly vulnerable to external shocks. When global commodity prices drop, the entire national revenue stream collapses. By refusing to build domestic industry, the national bourgeoisie is forced to rely exclusively on foreign capital to acquire technological innovation, heavy machinery, and finished consumer goods. A nation can hold a seat at the United Nations and fly its own flag, while its economy remains subordinate to global markets in every practical metric. Structural dependency guarantees the national bourgeoisie will always function as a junior partner serving foreign capital, rather than an autonomous engine for domestic development. Fanon predicted that this economic impotence would inevitably force the national bourgeoisie into political authoritarianism. Historically, the European bourgeoisie secured a degree of public consent because their factories created jobs, built physical infrastructure, and eventually raised aggregate living standards. The national bourgeoisie creates no new industrial wealth. Any economic concession given to the working class or the peasantry results in a direct, zero-sum loss of the ruling class's own accumulated capital. Facing this zero-sum reality, the ruling class abandons democratic consent. They rely entirely on state coercion, police forces, and military strength to protect their wealth from the public. Uganda's post-independence history serves as a primary test case for this political trajectory. In 1972, Idi Amin ordered the expulsion of 60,000 Asian traders, presenting the action to the public as a nationalistic victory of Africanization. The actual economic outcome was disastrous. Amin did not build productive capacity. He violently transferred existing merchant monopolies from one group to an alliance of military officials and local elites, destroying the broader economy in the process. When a ruling class cannot point to productive development to justify its power, nationalism becomes a violent, hollow cover for class consolidation and state theft. Fanon's determinism, however, faces a significant structural challenge from developmental state theory. Fanon assumed the national bourgeoisie would always operate autonomously, dictating terms to a weak government. He failed to account for scenarios where the state apparatus itself takes absolute control of the economy. Look at this map. These are the empirical outliers. The historical Asian tigers like South Korea and Taiwan, alongside African examples like Rwanda and Botswana, bypassed the intermediary trap. They achieved this through infant industry protection. An autonomous state erects strict tariffs to shield new, fragile domestic manufacturing from cheap foreign competition. A strong developmental state prevents the merchant class from taking the easy import route. It forcefully redirects that capital into industrial manufacturing through strict quotas and state-controlled bank loans. This countermodel demands immense institutional capacity and a meritocratic bureaucracy capable of disciplining local elites, elements that were systematically stripped from most post-colonial states. A powerful state can cure the bourgeoisie's economic impotence, but these regimes heavily rely on political repression. They force industrialization, but they validate Fanon's warnings about authoritarianism. We can apply Fanon's framework directly to the modern explosion of digital entrepreneurship and fintech platforms across East Africa. Global institutions present tech startups and digital platforms as proof of African economic autonomy. We must determine whether these platforms build autonomous productive capacity or simply function as a high-tech iteration of intermediary commerce. This map tracks modern African tech platforms. They run on networks and servers owned by foreign corporations. Local elites act as intermediaries, extracting raw data that flows into European and American intellectual property hubs, while importing foreign software to run the system. This digital ecosystem creates highly visible wealth for a thin tech elite in Nairobi or Kampala, but it cannot generate mass industrial employment or broad-based development for the working class. Without localized hardware manufacturing and foundational IP ownership, the digital economy does not break structural dependency. It updates the national bourgeoisie trap for the smartphone era. This structural theory is an actionable tool for analyzing modern policy debates, like Uganda's proposed 2026 Sovereignty Act. Legally restricting foreign ownership of land and business only works if the state simultaneously forces domestic capital to industrialize. When evaluating any development policy or foreign investment, ask one question: does this build physical, sovereign, productive capacity, or does it merely enrich the intermediary? Policies that transfer import monopolies to local citizens create the illusion of wealth generation. Structural transformation requires the grinding, capital-intensive work of building physical factories, research laboratories, and complex domestic supply chains. True economic decolonization is never achieved simply because a local elite inherits the state apparatus. Instead, it is only truly achieved when a sovereign nation definitively masters the means of its own physical production.